case Easy Rider is checking in for transport duty. Copy, Easy Rider.
Hey, welcome back everybody. This is our third and final video in this series of using AGHTM mission templates. We're going to show the final pieces to setting up your mission and show some possible ways that you can enhance your missions to make them a little more immersive and make them different. So the first thing that we need to do is, now that we've got our landing locations set up the way that we want them, we need to move our trigger zones into the areas that those landing zones represent. So I'm going to first just start by roughly placing them all over the center of the helipad as close as I can get visually. We're going to zoom in, and when we do, we'll see that they're really not as close as we think they are, but at least they're close enough for us to move into their final positions. Okay, so if we zoom into alpha, we'll see that we can move this trigger zone onto roughly the center of our pad. This trigger zone is going to be used for creating navigation beacons, so you really want it to represent your landing location as close as possible. I'll do these very quickly. And I'm just dragging them, getting them closer, zooming in, fine-tuning it. And last but not least, we have our Olympia trigger zone. Now, I mentioned it earlier, and now we're going to discuss what this little guy here is. So with my Olympia trigger zone set on my ship, those are used for creating navigation beacons and for measuring distance away to determine which radio menu button should be shown to determine if you're on approach or picking up passengers, etc. At the end of the mission, however, we need to determine whether or not you've landed at the final location. So this TZ landing zone represents the final location where you need to be at a standstill on the ground, terra firma, not moving at all. So we're just going to take this and we're going to line it up with our helipad. So now once the pilot arrives at the final destination, they'll come to rest on this helipad. AGHTM will determine that the pilot has landed. We then check to make sure they're landed within this zone and that all pickups have been completed, and if so, the mission ends. So now that we've got that established and everything is set up, there's one more outstanding task, which is the TZ start trigger zone. TZ start is the trigger zone that, once entered, will trigger your mission initially. So we need to make sure that we can take this trigger zone and place it somewhere between the starting position and the first location that's scheduled for pickup. So anywhere in between here, as long as the user has to cross that line to get to the first location, the mission will start successfully. So I usually like to try to put it as close as possible to the mission start position as such. Now I'm going to zoom my view out to about where I can see the maximum extents of my start and end point. I'm going to center that. This is what I really would want the users to see as the view when the map screen comes up. And this kind of represents the entire mission. I could use this to take screenshots and create kneeboard images. I could do a whole host of things. So once these trigger zones are all set up, we want to kind of realign some of these labels to put them in the right place. So I'm going to again bring up the draw panel, and I'm going to move my markers to locations that more closely represent the actual location of the landing area. Maybe something like that. Go ahead and save. So at this point, we have a fully functional AGHTM mission with 5 pickups. We have set the weather, we've set the date and time for the mission, we've moved all of the respective trigger zones into the correct locations to represent our landing areas, and we could now fly our mission. We're going to take it one step further, and we're going to show you a couple ways that you can potentially make your mission a little bit more immersive. One thing I forgot is we want to go ahead and we want to draw the flight path in here. This is good for the pilot who's flying to be able to see kind of where they are, maybe look at the F10 map before they take off and see what their planned flight is. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. So with the draw panel open, now I want to make sure that I have the line button selected. This will now allow me to draw a line versus selecting an existing object. Segments selected. If you want to be consistent with the way that we've built the mission bundles, you can go ahead and change the color to white and make it a thickness of 4 pixels. Now what we want to do is we want to just go ahead and zoom all the way in here to our starting location, and I'm just going to click on this helicopter, and once I do, I now have a line that's anchored at the start point that I clicked on. So now I can zoom out, I can move my map to different locations, I can zoom all the way in. Once I get to this location, I'm just going to click one time, and I've now created a new anchor point. I can zoom out. Again, clicking to add another anchor point. And I'm just going to do this all the way down. Charlie, Delta, Echo is our oil rig. And finally, at Olympia. Now when I click on my last location, I get this line that still wants to continue drawing beyond this point, but since this is my last point, I can just go ahead and hit the escape key, which will now end the drawing. Unfortunately, it does close the draw panel, so I'm going to go ahead and reopen the draw panel, and now I'm going to make sure I choose select, and I'm simply going to click anywhere on this white line. Now if you notice, we've selected this object over here in the draw panel. Its name is line 1. And the first thing we want to do is we want to set the binding layer. Currently it's on author, so we'll only see that object from the mission editor. If we change it to common, now anyone flying the mission will be able to see this object on the map. Another thing that we want to do, just from a cleanup perspective, is we're going to go ahead and change the name of that object to flight plan. And now I'm just going to go ahead and hit Control S to save. The only thing left to do is open the trigger zone list and hide all of our trigger zones. So the one thing that I want to do to add a little bit of immersion here is, as we're flying down this coast, maybe we want to have some cargo ships, cruising down the coast alongside of us, just to add some scenery. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit S to add a ship. I'm going to add a waypoint here and here, and we're just going to go ahead and we're going to set this to be the cap container ship. This is from the Civilian Assets Pack Navy mod. And I'm just going to copy this, and I'm just going to make a couple copies here. So now as we take off and we start flying, we should see some cargo ships on the left hand side as we're heading south down the coast. That's one way. That's one thing you can do. Another thing that you could do is you could potentially add enemies here that prevent you from landing at pickup locations. You could then add additional slots for someone to potentially fly as an escort for you to clear the area prior to you making pickups at each location. Really, you're just kind of limited by your imagination as far as what you want to do. Another thing that I like to do, though, is I do like to add some helicopter traffic so that as I'm flying, I just kind of have somebody to wave to as I'm flying by them. So what I like to do is I'll add a helicopter group, and let's just say we'll put start one here, and we're going to make this AGL 500. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to click another waypoint up here somewhere. We don't really care what it does beyond that because we're going to pass it and never see it again. The other thing that I want to do is I want to set this to be late activation. Setting it to late activation means that it will not spawn when the mission starts. It will, however, spawn when code is run to make this object spawn. And we'll go ahead and we'll say that this is going to be another Black Hawk squadron. Maybe there's 2 of them. And then down here we'll add another one that starts here. Oops, I'm sorry. We'll maybe add another one down here. Again, we'll do this AGL 500 and we'll add another waypoint here. And we're going to make this one spawn late again. And the idea is what we're going to do is as the player flies south here, once they enter trigger zone Bravo, we're going to go ahead and spawn this first helicopter group in. Once the user hits trigger zone Delta, we're going to go ahead and spawn this second group in. So let's go ahead and choose this, and we're just going to call this group spawn 1, and we'll call this second one spawn 2. We're only concerned with the group names. We're not really too concerned with the unit names. This one, the second one, we'll make it be a 3 ship of MI8s. So we'll have MI8 and we'll make it a flight of 3. Now we need to add something that's going to go ahead and trigger these objects to spawn. So this would be a good time to show you the other elements of the mission that come with the template. If we click over here on the triggers button, you can see there's a lot of canned triggers that are already placed in the mission for you. The first trigger is responsible for loading all of the audio assets that are loaded into the mission that provide things like approach and departure messaging, mission instructions, and some various other things. There's some Morse code files in here that are meant to serve as the navigation beacons, and various other audio files. Next up, the green section here are all of the scripts that are loaded as part of the mission framework. I won't go into detail on these, but you can see that these first 3 scripts here, first we have MIST loaded, then we have these first 3 scripts that begin with AG. These are all part of the AG script library, which will be coming soon. Keep an eye out for that. Next up, we load the AGHTM file, the AGHTM Lua library. This is the library that's responsible for all of the wiring of the actual transport mission, and also what we're talking about here today. Next up, we have our config file for AGHTM, which represents navigation beacon information, for example, as well as various other data that's needed to run the mission. The default values in this mission template file will more than suffice for any missions that you create. If you want to do customization, for example, changing station names or audio files that are used, or the number of pickup locations, etc., you can modify your own AGHTM file. That'll be covered under a different section within the AGHTM script library reference. So next up, we have the file that's essentially responsible for initializing our mission. We go into that in another section as well. We have the start mission trigger. This is the trigger that I mentioned when the player unit Easy Rider 1-1 enters the trigger zone TZ start, the mission will start. You don't need to be concerned with what's happening in here unless you want to be, in which case you can look at the other documentation sections on the site for more information. Next up, we have conditions for each of the trigger locations. So whenever a player enters the trigger zone, this will be responsible for adding radio menu buttons to allow them to signal their approach to the location. These are all identical in nature with the exception of the correct station being swapped out. So one thing to note is these are switched conditions. So each time the pilot leaves the trigger zone and then re-enters the trigger zone, this trigger will fire. These leave triggers work the same way, but each time that the player leaves the trigger zone, re-enters, and then leaves again, it will trigger again. The leave triggers are responsible for removing the approach and pickup radio menu buttons should the pilot leave the trigger zone before making the pickup. And then finally, we have a trigger here that just simply checks to see if AGHTM has completed and the AGHTM end mission flag is true. If so, it ends the mission with a success message that says, hey, mission completed successfully. Now, in order to facilitate our helicopters taking off, we said in one case we wanted, when the user entered Bravo, we wanted to spawn the unit at Charlie. We wanted to spawn group spawn 1. And when the player entered the Delta trigger zone, we wanted to spawn group spawn 2. So we can either piggyback off of the existing triggers. So for example, enter Bravo, and we could add a new activity here to group activate our spawn 1 group. The problem with that is this trigger will break if the user leaves the trigger zone and then re-enters it, forcing the trigger to be fired again because the unit would already be activated and this would cause an error. So we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're just going to mirror this trigger, and we're going to say when the player enters Bravo, so I'm going to click clone on that trigger, and for right now I'm just going to make it a different color and we'll do some cleanup later on. I'll just make it yellow for now. So now, same condition, when the unit enters trigger zone TZ Bravo, instead of this do script action, we're going to add a new one. We're going to delete that one and add a new one. Group activate. We're going to select our group spawn 1. And now the important part is we need to change this to a once trigger. So now this solves the problem of this will only fire one time, the very first time that the player pilot enters the Bravo trigger zone. We want to do the same thing for Delta. So again, you could piggyback off of the enter Delta switch condition trigger, or we can clone it, make it a once trigger, same condition. When Easy Rider 1 enters Delta, we're going to go ahead and delete that action, and we're going to go ahead and make this another group activate, and in this case we're going to do spawn 2. So I'm going to go ahead and save the mission, and I'll just zoom it and center it so that everything fits kind of within frame like we had it before, and I'm just going to go ahead and save it again. Now at this point we've completed the mission, and we could go ahead and fly it, test it out. We would see that our cargo ships are sailing alongside of us to our left for the first leg. Once we hit Bravo and we are traveling between Bravo and Charlie, we should see the additional air traffic of these two Blackhawks flying at 500 feet AGL. Once we continue to make our pickups and arrive at Delta, once we enter the Delta trigger zone, we will be spawning in group spawn 2, which will continue traveling this way, and then while we're traveling between Delta and Echo, we should see that 3 ship of MI8s flying along. So that completes our discussion on using AGHTM mission templates. See you out there. If you like these videos, don't forget to click the thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching. Until next time, Coder out.